Okay, so when you asked for a deep dive on Peanut the squirrel, I gotta admit, I was intrigued. The whole internet's kind of obsessed with this little guy. And I get it. It's way more than just some cute animal thing. It brings up all these really interesting questions about the laws we have to protect wildlife. And what happens when those laws clash with really unusual situations.
Yeah, for sure. And it's fascinating, right, how Peanut's story played out. It really shows how powerful social media is. Like how it can turn something local into a global thing almost overnight.
Totally. So for everyone listening, we dug into a ton of stuff, articles, social media posts, even legal documents. To give you the full story here, we're going to look at how a squirrel, Peanut, became this internet sensation, why he was taken from his home, and what his case could mean for the future of these wildlife laws.
Yeah, it all starts 7 years ago with Mark Longo finding this tiny squirrel, like a baby squirrel. It was orphaned after its mom was hit by a car. Tragic, really. And that's cool.
Was Peanut... And this wasn't just a quick rescue and release, right? Mark actually tried a bunch of times to put Peanut back in the wild. But Peanut just kept coming back to him.
Right. Which is, kind of unusual for squirrels. They're usually solitary creatures.
Yeah.
But Peanut, he really seemed to, he formed this bond with Mark. It's really at the heart of this whole thing.
Totally. That bond, you can see it when you look at Peanut's life with Mark. He wasn't just out in the backyard or something. Peanut was part of the family, living inside the house, hanging out with Mark's cat, Chloe.
Right. And of course, we can't forget, Peanut becoming an internet star. His Instagram, over 1,400 posts. It's amazing. It shows his personality, how playful he was, the joy he brought to people, all over the world.
Seriously. He was hula hooping, eating waffles. I mean, come on. How could you not love this little guy? And his story, starting with, surviving as an orphan, it really it resonated with people. And I think it's interesting, why Peanut's story went viral specifically. There's tons of cute animal videos, right? But something about Peanut really grabbed the world's attention.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. It's there's something deeper going on, I think. People just have this need to connect with animals, and social media lets that happen. No matter where you are in the world, we see Peanut playing, being goofy, we see his bond with Mark, and we get invested. It's like he becomes part of our family, too, even if we've never, met him.
That's such a good point, and it makes what happened next even more shocking, really, this sweet story. It takes a turn when the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, gets involved.
All right, he got complaints, looked into it, and they decided to remove Peanut from Mark's care. The reason: New York state law doesn't allow keeping wildlife as pets.
Right, and obviously, these laws are there to protect everyone. Animals and people. Yeah. The DEC was worried about rabies and the danger of having, a wild animal
in a home. Exactly. And that's where things get complicated.
Yeah.
It's not just about enforcing the rules. Peanut's situation, it brings up all these questions about when or if exceptions to these rules might be okay.
Yeah, especially when you think about how close Mark and Peanut had become over 7 years. And of course, taking Peanut away, it had a huge impact on his fans online. It was part of this this unique family was just ripped away.
Yeah, and then the DEC saying that Peanut would probably be euthanized. That just, that really made things worse.
Oh, yeah.
The public was outraged instantly. People saying euthanasia was just way too cruel. For a squirrel who'd been living peacefully in a home for so long.
Totally. And almost immediately, right? A Change.org petition pops up demanding Peanut be returned. Tens of thousands of signatures. Within days, people were flooding social media, messages of support, sharing videos, even starting fundraisers to help Mark with lawyers.
Right. And it's interesting, the language they used in these online campaigns. It wasn't just about saving Peanut. It was about righting a wrong. The DEC was the villain. Heartless bureaucrats, tearing a loving family apart. And that framing, plus all the images of Peanut playing with Mark and Chloe, it was really effective. It got people on their side.
Yeah, you're right. It was very, very strategic. It tapped into people's empathy and that desire to see, a happy ending to a story they'd become invested in. One comment really stuck with me. Someone said, Peanut brought so much joy during dark times. And it really shows the impact he had on people, even those who, only knew him through a screen. And it brings us to this big question. Should there be exceptions to these wildlife laws?
That's the core issue, isn't it? Those fighting for Peanut, they argue that after 7 years in a home, he's not going to make it if he's put back in the wild. They say his bond with Mark shows this is a totally unique situation. one that deserves to be looked at differently.
Yeah, but then there's the other side, saying it's important to enforce these laws to protect wildlife. And people, they worry that making exceptions could be dangerous. Like, it could end up harming more animals.
It's tough, right? No easy answers. To really get it, I think, we need to look closer at the laws, the specific laws about wildlife in New York.
Yeah, you're right. Let's get into the details and see if there are any, like, precedents for cases like Peanuts. This is where it gets really interesting because it's not just about feelings. It's about understanding the law and how it says we should interact with wildlife.
Exactly. So if we look at the New York State Environmental Conservation Law, Article 11, Title 7, that's the part about possessing wildlife. And there are very clear rules about keeping wild animals as pets.
Right. And I know you dug into the actual
illegal
wording. What does it say exactly about cases like Peanuts?
Well, Section 110511, that was really important here. It says, no person shall possess any wildlife except under permit or license. Now, there are exceptions for like rehabilitators or licensed professionals. But for most people, keeping a wild animal as a pet, like a squirrel, is completely against the law.
So based on that, the DEC was, they were allowed to take Peanut. But does the law like have any flexibility? Could Mark have gotten a permit? Maybe.
That's a great question. And it's where things get a little unclear.
Yeah.
The law does say permits can be given for some things, like educational exhibits or scientific research. But there's nothing about giving a permit to someone who's formed a strong bond with a wild animal, even if it's a really unusual situation.
So it sounds like the law, as it's written now, doesn't really consider that bond. That can happen between people and animals in cases like Peanuts. But have there been any times when the DEC has, made exceptions?
That's what we'll look at next. There have been a few cases, high-profile ones, in the last few years, that challenge, how strict these laws are. And they give us some insight into how the DEC handles these situations.
Yeah.
Ethically, it's very complex. We'll look at those cases and see if they offer any hope. For Peanut, going back to Mark.
So, okay, the law seems like pretty straightforward. But have there been any cases where the DEC kind of bent the rules a little?
There have been a few, yeah, to give us some context, I guess. A couple of years ago, there was this case with a fawn. It had been rescued, and it imprinted on this family. After it was orphaned, the DEC, at first they said the fawn had to be released. But then there was a lot of public pressure, and there was evidence, too, that the fawn wouldn't survive, on its own. So they gave the family a special permit to keep it drawn.
Wow. So there is like some precedent for being flexible in these like unique situations. That's got to give Peanut supporters some hope, right?
It does, yeah. But it's important to remember, they look at each case individually.
Yeah.
The DEC, they consider things like the animal species, how old it is, whether it could be, rehabilitated and released successfully, and of course, public safety.
Right. It's a tough balance for sure. But it makes you wonder, are the laws we have now about wildlife, are they too rigid? Could they be like updated to consider these unusual situations without, messing up the whole point of protecting animals and ecosystems?
That's a great question, and something a lot of wildlife experts are thinking about. They're realizing that this one-size-fits-all approach, it might not always be the best way, especially now with, human-wildlife interactions becoming more and more common.
Yeah, it makes you think, is there a way to like find a middle ground, a way to think about the well-being of like individual animals, but also the bigger picture?
Some experts have suggested, a more nuanced system, one that allows for permits, but with conditions in cases where there are these strong bonds, and the animal's well-being is a concern as long as certain criteria are met.
That sounds promising. It would need like careful thought and strict oversight, of course, but it could be a more compassionate way to handle things in these, exceptional cases.
Exactly. And it fits with a bigger trend in wildlife management.
Yeah.
Moving away from just reacting to things and toward, being more proactive, considering how complex things are between humans and animals in a world that's constantly changing.
So it's not just about like enforcing the laws we have now. It's about adapting how we approach conservation as we learn more about animal behavior and human-animal relationships.
Exactly. And Peanut's case, it's really highlighted this need for discussion and reevaluation.
While we wait to see what happens with Peanut, it's important to remember the bigger picture. Peanut's story is just one example of this increasingly complex relationship between humans and wildlife. As the human population grows and natural habitats shrink, we're going to see more and more interactions with wild animals.
And that brings up a whole lot of challenges. How do we handle those interactions in a way that minimizes conflict? How do we balance the needs of people and animals when we share the same environment?
And how do we, encourage people to be responsible and to respect wildlife, even in, in cities and suburbs?
Just about recognizing that. We're not just, coexisting with wildlife. We're actively shaping their world, and they're shaping ours. Everything you do, how we develop land, the policies we make, it all has an impact on this delicate balance of ecosystems.
Which brings us back to Peanut. He's become, a symbol of all these complicated issues. He reminds us that our relationship with wildlife, it's always changing.
And we can't forget, his legacy online, Peanut's Instagram, hundreds of thousands of followers. It shows how powerful social media can be for building connections and getting people involved in a cause.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique part of this case. Makes you wonder how social media will continue to shape our relationship with wildlife and influence conservation efforts.
That's a powerful tool, no doubt. It could be used for education, advocacy, even research. But it also has its challenges. We have to be careful about misinformation, emotional manipulation, and the danger of, thinking of wild animals like they're humans.
Right. It's about finding that balance, just like we're trying to find that balance in how we manage wildlife.
Exactly. It's about using the power of social media, but also staying grounded in science, ethical considerations, and a deep respect for the natural world.
So, as we wait to see what happens with Peanut, let's keep all this in mind. It's not just about one squirrel. It's about finding ways to live in harmony with all creatures in a world where the lines between us and them are getting blurrier and blurrier. It feels like we've barely scratched the surface here.
I know, right? It shows how much Peanut's case has. You've really gotten to people. They want information. They want to understand these wildlife laws and what it means to live alongside wild animals, responsibly, of course.
And while we're all, waiting to see what happens with Peanut, his story, it's already had such a big impact. It's really, shown a light on how complicated wildlife management is in a way that few other cases have.
Yeah, absolutely. It's made us ask these tough questions about the limits of our compassion, the consequences of our actions, even when we mean well, and need for, for everyone to talk to each other. Policymakers, scientists, the public.
One thing that really sticks out to me is how the public sees this. It seems like the DEC, they're stuck between following the law and responding to how people feel. About Peanut.
That's a big part of it, We're seeing how the traditional way of managing wildlife, focusing on data and the law, it's being challenged by this approach that's more emotional.
And public facing. And social media's had a huge role in that, hasn't it?
Oh, for sure. It's given people a way to speak up, to get support, to even influence policy decisions.
The reaction online to Peanut being taken away, it was so fast and so big, nothing we've seen before. It makes you think about the future of fighting for wildlife and how digital activism can change our relationship.
It looks like we're seeing conservation becoming more democratic. The public wants a say in how we protect and manage wildlife.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing in a lot of ways. Shows that people are more aware of how connected we are to nature. And they want solutions that work for everyone, people and animals. But like any kind of activism, there are things to watch out for. We got to be careful about those emotional appeals that oversimplify things, or that, put the well-being of one animal above the health of the whole ecosystem.
So it's about balance again, right?
Exactly. Using that passion, that energy, but making sure our actions are based on science.
Yeah.
And a long-term view of conservation.
So where do we go from here? How do we deal with all this? Public emotion, social media, wildlife law, it's all kind of,
intertwined. I think the key is talking to each other, working together. We need to create spaces where we can have real discussions. Where everyone can share their perspective. And we can look at the science and think about the ethical side of things.
So it's about bridging that gap, right? Between what the law says and compassion. Between what individual animals need and the health of the planet.
Yeah, and we need to move past those simple stories of good guys and bad guys. It's more complicated than that. There are no easy answers. But if we talk to each other with respect and work together, we can find solutions that are good for wildlife and for us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Peanut's story, I want to leave you with some things to think about. What role should our feelings play in making policies about wildlife? How do we make sure our actions are guided by both compassion and what we know from science? And in the end, what kind of future do we want for ourselves and for the animals we share this planet with? Thanks for joining us. And keep thinking about all this, because Peanut's story, it's not over yet. So